The year was 1887, and the silence in the parsonage was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, a smothering quality like the dust cloths Esther Hale had draped over her father's theological texts. 3 months had passed since the town of Providence Creek had buried the Reverend Michael Hale, and the silence he left behind was louder than any sermon he had ever preached. It echoed in the empty rooms, clung to the tall, stark furniture, and settled deep in Esther's bones, a cold companion to the Dakota autumn that was bleeding the color from the world outside. Her life had become a litany of quiet, repetitive tasks. She rose before the sun painted the eastern plains in pale, watery shades of rose and gray. She tended the small vegetable patch, her hands chapped from the lye soap and the increasingly sharp wind. She baked her bread, the scent of yeast a lonely ghost in the cavernous kitchen. She mended linens, her stitches small and perfect, a testament to a discipline that felt more like a cage than a virtue. The townspeople watched her. From behind their lace curtains and over the tops of their general store ledgers, they watched. They saw the preacher's daughter, a figure of somber piety, a living monument to her father's unbending righteousness. They did not see the woman drowning in the quiet. Her father had been a man carved from granite and gospel, his voice a booming instrument of judgment that could make the most stalwart sinner tremble. He had loved her in his way, a severe, demanding love that equated obedience with affection. He had shaped her, molded her, and left her with a legacy of expectations she could neither fulfill nor escape. Now, at 24, she was an orphan, a spinster, living on the charity of a congregation that pitied her but did not understand her. The parsonage was hers only until the new preacher arrived from back east, a deadline that hung over her like a guillotine. Loneliness was not new to her, but this strain of it was different. It was an isolation that went deeper than the mere absence of people. It was a disconnect from herself. Who was she, without her father's shadow to stand in? She would sometimes catch her reflection in the dark glass of the window, at twilight, a pale, serious face, hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache, her grey dress a uniform of perpetual mourning. The woman in the glass was a stranger. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a fresh bruise gathered in the west, the silence was broken. It was not a knock at the door or the call of a neighbor, but a sound so out of place it startled her from her mending. It was a frantic, rustling scramble in the dry leaves near the woodshed, followed by a choked sob. Esther froze, her needle poised in midair. The world outside the parsonage was not always kind. Wanderers and hard men sometimes passed through, and her father's protection, formidable as it had been, was buried with him on the hill. She placed her sewing basket on the table with deliberate care, her movements slow and measured to conceal the tremor in her hands. She walked to the window, peering through the wavy, imperfect glass. There, huddled against the rough-hewn wood of the shed, was a child, a boy no older than 7 or 8, his dark hair matted with dirt and leaves, his deerskin leggings torn. He was a native child, Lakota from the look of him, and he was shaking, not from the cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. One of his arms was clutched to his chest, and a dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his tunic. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what her father would have done. He would have marched outside, his Bible a shield and a weapon, and ordered the boy off his property, decrying him as a heathen, a savage. The town's sentiments would have been the same. Fear and prejudice were the twin currencies of Providence Creek. To help this child was to invite scorn, suspicion, and possibly danger. But what she saw was not a heathen. She saw a terrified little boy, his eyes wide and dark like a cornered animal's. She saw the blood. The preacher's daughter, the pious woman of routine and resignation, felt something else stir within her, something fierce and protective that had long been dormant. It was an impulse that belonged not to her father's child, but to herself. She took a deep breath, unlatched the back door, and stepped out into the cold, unforgiving air. The boy, whose name was Chayton, flinched violently when the door creaked open. He pressed himself flatter against the wood, making a small, wounded sound. Esther stopped, holding up her hands, palms open, a gesture she hoped would translate across the chasm of language and fear that separated them. "It is all right," she said, her voice softer than she had intended, husky from disuse. "I will not hurt you." He did not understand the words, but he seemed to register the tone. His terrified gaze flickered from her face to her hands and back again. Esther took another slow step forward. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she impatiently pushed it away. She knelt, ignoring the damp, cold earth seeping through the fabric of her skirt, trying to make herself smaller, less threatening. "You are hurt," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the stain on his arm. She pointed to it, then to herself, then gestured toward the open door of the house. It was a clumsy pantomime of offering aid, but it was all she had. For a long moment he just stared, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Then his resolve seemed to crumble. A fresh wave of tears tracked clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him inside was a delicate operation. He moved with a skittish uncertainty, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. She led him not into the formal parlor, but to the kitchen, the warmest room in the house. She sat him on a low stool near the hearth where embers still glowed from her morning fire. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now, charged with tension and the unspoken reality of their situation. His injury was a deep gash on his forearm, ugly and crusted with dirt, but it did not appear to be from a bullet. It looked as if he had caught it on a sharp branch or a piece of jagged metal during a desperate flight. Esther fetched the basin, warm water, and clean cloths. As she gently began to clean the wound, he hissed in pain, but did not pull away. He watched her every move, his dark eyes never leaving her face, searching for any sign of betrayal. She worked with a focused tenderness that surprised even herself. She had tended her father through his final illness, but that had been an act of duty. This felt different. This was a choice. As she cleaned the wound and applied a poultice of yarrow to stem the bleeding, she saw the exhaustion etched onto his small frame. He was bone-weary, running on the last dregs of adrenaline. She wrapped his arm in clean strips of linen, her movements efficient and sure. When she was finished, she offered him a cup of milk and a thick slice of the bread she had baked that morning. He hesitated, looking from the food to her face, his suspicion warring with a hunger that was painfully evident. She took a small bite of the bread herself, then pushed the plate gently toward him. That seemed to be the reassurance he needed. He ate ravenously, his small hands trembling as he brought the food to his mouth. Esther sat opposite him, watching the firelight play over his features. The fear was still there, a shadow in his eyes, but it was banked now, overlaid with a profound weariness. She saw the intricate beadwork on his worn moccasins, the small feather tied into his hair. He was not an abstraction, not a savage from her father's sermons. He was a child, someone's son, and he was utterly alone. A wave of empathy, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. His loneliness called out to her own, a silent recognition in the quiet kitchen. That night, she made him a bed of blankets in the small pantry, a windowless room where he might feel secure. There was no lock on the door, but she propped a chair against it from the outside, a gesture meant more for her own peace of mind than for his containment. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that he was not just lost, he was being hunted. The following day passed in a state of suspended reality. Esther went about her chores, her senses on high alert. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every snap of a twig like a footstep. She brought Chaitan food and fresh water, and for the first time he offered her a flicker of a smile, a brief, shy gesture that struck her with the force of a physical blow. They did not speak, could not speak, but a fragile thread of understanding was being woven between them in the silence. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way he would hold himself perfectly still when a floorboard creaked upstairs. He, in turn, seemed to learn the cadence of her movements, the gentle swish of her skirts as she moved about the house. Later that afternoon, she made the necessary trip to the general store. The air in town was thick with a nervous energy she recognized immediately. Mr. Callahan, the proprietor, was polishing the counter with a vigor that betrayed his anxiety. "Afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, his eyes darting toward the door. "Nasty business." "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her voice even. "What business is that?" "Couple of men rode in this morning," he said, lowering his voice. "Hard types, led by a man named Vance, asking questions. About the Lakota." He paused, then added, "They're looking for a survivor, a boy. Seems there was some trouble out at the Blackwood claim. The whole family, gone. They say the boy saw it all." A cold dread washed over Esther. It was confirmation of what she had already known: Garrett Vance. She had heard the name before, whispered in connection with land disputes and missing livestock, a man who operated in the murky space between lawman and outlaw. "They believe he came this way?" she asked, fighting to keep her expression neutral as she gathered her meager supplies. "They're checking every homestead, every farm," Callahan said, shaking his head. "The sheriff went with them, more for show than anything, I reckon. That Vance has a mean look about him. Best to stay indoors, Miss Hale." Esther nodded, paid for her flour and salt, and walked back to the parsonage, her mind racing. The bubble of safety she had created around the boy had just been pierced. They were coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. She looked at the stark, clapboard church next to her home, at the cross reaching toward the unforgiving sky. She felt no comfort there. Her father's God was a God of judgment and rules, and she was breaking all of them. The protection she sought would not come from heaven, it would have to come from her. When she returned, Chayton must have sensed the change in her. He was standing by the pantry door, his body tense. She met his gaze and knew she could not hide the truth from him. She knelt before him, taking his small, uninjured hand in hers. "Men are coming," she said softly, knowing he would not understand the words but would feel their weight. "We have to hide, a better place." She spent the rest of the afternoon watching the road from the upstairs window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She thought of the river. The Providence Creek, from which the town took its name, curled around the back of the parsonage property. It was wide and shallow in most places, but the banks were steep and overgrown with willows and cottonwoods, their leaves now a brittle, faded gold. It was a place of wildness, a place the townspeople generally avoided. As dusk began to settle, she saw them three riders on the horizon, moving with a grim purpose. The sheriff was with them, looking uncomfortable and small next to the man she presumed was Vance, who sat his horse with an arrogant stillness. There was no more time. She grabbed Chayton's hand. "Come," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. He looked at her, his eyes wide, but he did not resist. He trusted her. The weight of that trust was immense. She pulled her darkest, heaviest wool shawl from its hook and led him out the back door, scurrying low to the ground, using the woodshed and the overgrown fence line as cover. The air was bitingly cold now, with the damp promise of the coming night. The river was a ribbon of dark, churning silver in the fading light. The sound of it, a constant, rushing murmur, seemed to amplify the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She scanned the bank, her eyes desperate, and found a place where the current had carved out a hollow beneath the roots of a great cottonwood. The water was deeper there, shielded from the main path by a thick curtain of drooping willow branches. It was their only chance. "We must go in the water," she tried to explain with frantic gestures, pointing to the spot, then to them. He shivered, his gaze fixed on the cold, dark current. He was afraid of the water, but he was more afraid of the men. He nodded, his small face a mask of grim resolve. Esther did not hesitate. She hitched up her heavy skirts and stepped into the river. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, a physical assault that stole the air from her lungs and shot up her legs in needles of pure agony. It was far colder than she had imagined, the glacial melt from mountains 100 miles away. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. She waded deeper, the current pulling at her clothes, and reached back for Chayton. She pulled him in after her, and he gasped as the icy water swirled around his waist. She held him tight against her, his small, shivering body pressed to hers. She maneuvered them into the hollow under the bank, pulling the weeping willow branches around them like a shroud. Her heavy, dark wool skirts fanned out in the water, helping to break up their silhouettes. She stood in water up to her own waist, her arms wrapped around the boy, her back pressed against the cold, muddy earth of the bank, and they waited. The cold was a living entity. It began as a pain, a sharp, searing fire in her feet and legs. Then it transformed into a deep, consuming ache that worked its way into her bones. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, and she clamped her jaw shut, praying the sound would not carry. She held Chayton's head against her chest, trying to shield him with the last vestiges of her own body heat, murmuring wordless sounds of comfort into his hair. He was shaking too, a constant, violent tremor that she felt through her entire body. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into eternities. The sky deepened from indigo to black, and a sliver of moon cast a sickly, pale light on the water's surface. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out, to flee the torturous cold. Her legs grew numb, then her hips, a terrifying deadness that spread upward. She could no longer feel her feet at all. She was a statue of ice, with a terrified, beating heart at her core. Then she heard them, the crunch of hooves on gravel, the low, guttural voices of men. "He can't have gone far," a voice snarled. It was Vance. The sound was close, terrifyingly close. They were on the path, just above the riverbank. "He's just a whelp, probably curled up and frozen in a ditch by now," another man said with a cruel laugh. Esther held her breath. She pressed Chayton's face into her shoulder, her own body a shield. She could feel the boy's heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, heavy thud of her own. She prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, prayed for silence, prayed for invisibility. A horse snorted directly above them. A stone, dislodged by a hoof, tumbled down the bank and splashed into the water a few feet away. Esther's entire body went rigid. Chayton stiffened in her arms. She was certain they were discovered. She closed her eyes, a strange sense of calm washing over the terror. She had done all she could. "Nothing down there but mud and cold water," Vance's voice cut through the darkness. "Waste of time. He probably headed south, back toward his own kind. We'll ride out at first light." She heard the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather, as the men turned their horses and rode away. Their voices faded, swallowed by the rush of the river and the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. They were gone. But Esther could not move. The release of tension left her utterly depleted. The cold, which had been a sharp enemy, was now a dull, heavy cloak, dragging her down. A profound lethargy was setting in, a dangerous, seductive warmth blooming in her chest as her body began to surrender. She knew, in a distant part of her mind, that this was how people died in the cold. You simply fell asleep. She fought it. She forced her eyes open, focusing on the moonlit ripples on the water. She thought of the boy in her arms. She could not fail him now. She tried to shift her weight, to take a step, but her legs would not obey. They were useless, alien things, trapped in the icy grip of the river. Panic began to set in, a cold, clear-headed terror that was worse than the fear of Vance and his men. They had survived the hunters, only to be claimed by the river itself. How long they stood there, she did not know. An hour, 2. The world had shrunk to the circle of her arms holding the boy and the relentless, numbing cold. She was beginning to drift, her thoughts becoming slow and syrupy, when a new sound reached her. It was not the sound of Vance's men. It was the soft, rhythmic dip of paddles in water. She lifted her head, a monumental effort. Downstream, moving with a silent, ghostly grace, were 2 canoes. Figures of men, their shapes dark against the moonlight on the water, knelt within them. Her first thought was that the outlaws had returned. But these men moved differently, with a quiet purpose that spoke not of plunder, but of pursuit. One of the canoes angled toward her side of the river. A man in the bow lifted a hand, and the paddling stopped. They drifted, listening. Esther's heart, which she thought had slowed to a near stop, gave a painful lurch. Chayton stirred in her arms, lifting his head. He let out a small, weak cry, a sound that was not of fear but of recognition, a name. The man in the canoe answered, his voice low and resonant, a single Lakota word that flowed like the river itself. He had been tracking them, tracking the boy, and tracking his hunters. The canoe glided closer until it nudged the bank beside her. The man, his face weathered and stern in the moonlight, looked at her. He saw the white woman, her dress soaked and dark, her face pale as bone. He saw the boy she clutched to her chest. His gaze traveled down to where she stood, rooted in the freezing water. His expression, which had been hard and wary, shifted. It was not softness, but a profound, solemn understanding that passed over his features. Without a word, he and another man slipped from the canoe into the thigh-deep water. They did not recoil from the cold. They moved toward her, and Esther felt a final, exhausted tear freeze on her cheek. She had no strength left to be afraid. One of the warriors gently took Chayton from her arms. The boy went without protest, his eyes fixed on her face, a look of silent, wrenching gratitude. The other man, the leader, put his strong hands under Esther's arms. "We have you," he said, his English slow and accented, but clear. She tried to walk, but her legs buckled instantly. They were no longer hers to command. The man lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his grip firm and impersonal, and carried her from the water. He laid her on the bank, on a thick buffalo robe that another warrior had spread on the frozen ground. The agony of returning sensation was excruciating, 1,000 burning needles pricking her flesh. They wrapped her in another dry, warm robe, the scent of wood smoke and leather enveloping her. She watched through a haze of pain and exhaustion as Chayton was passed to a man who held him with the tenderness of a father. It was his uncle, Tashunka, the stern-faced man who had carried her from the river. He spoke to the boy in low, comforting tones, and the child finally broke, his body racked with the sobs he had held back for so long. Tashunka turned back to Esther. He knelt beside her, his presence immense. He looked at her chattering teeth and her pale, drawn face. He looked at the river, then back at her. He said nothing for a long time, the only sounds the rushing water and the boy's quiet weeping. "You stood in the river," he said finally. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, weighted with awe. You stood against the cold, for him. Esther could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. "The men who hunted him are cowards," Tashunka continued, his voice low and hard as river stone. "They will be found. What you did, that was not cowardice. That was a warrior's heart in the body of a white woman." He placed a hand briefly over his own heart, a gesture of profound respect. They did not stay long. They had to keep moving, but before they left, they built a small, efficient fire and made her drink a hot, bitter tea that sent warmth creeping back into her veins. They ensured she could stand, albeit unsteadily, on her own 2 feet before they departed as silently as they had arrived, 2 canoes swallowed by the darkness, leaving only a dying fire and the lingering scent of smoke. Esther stumbled back to the parsonage, a ghost returning to her own life. The house was cold and empty, but the silence felt different now. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of stillness, of peace. She collapsed into her bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the days that followed, a change settled over her. The town of Providence Creek continued on, unaware of the life-and-death drama that had unfolded at its edge. They still saw the preacher's daughter, but she was no longer her father's shadow. The fear of their judgment had been scoured from her by the freezing water. She had faced a far greater trial and had not been found wanting. She had found a strength that was entirely her own, forged in the icy crucible of the river. Weeks later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the plains, a rider from a friendly trading post brought her a package. It had been left for her, he said, by a Lakota man. Inside, wrapped in soft doe skin, was a pair of exquisitely beaded moccasins, small enough for a woman, and a single perfect falcon's feather. There was no note. None was needed. Esther never saw Chayton or Tashunka again. The new preacher arrived in the spring, and she moved from the parsonage into a small cabin she bought with the last of her father's meager savings. The town still whispered, but their words were like the wind now, a sound that passed by without touching her. She had found her own ground to stand on, and the river, the site of her ordeal and her transformation, was given a new name. The Lakota, in their travels, no longer called it Providence Creek, a name that meant nothing to them. They called it Wachiwi Zitkala Wakpathe, River of the Cardinal Woman, for the dark red shawl she had worn that was the color of a steadfast heart. But the traders and the trappers who heard the name translated it more simply. They called it Brave Woman Creek. The name stuck. It was etched onto new maps, a permanent landmark of courage, a quiet, enduring testament to the preacher's daughter who had once stood in its freezing waters, and in doing so, had finally found a way home to herself.